Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Charlie Arnott. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Center for Food Integrity, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Protein Play, Emerging Trends and Consumer Appetites for Protein Alternatives. Really appreciate you spending some time with us this afternoon. We have some excellent panelists from Tyson, White Castle, and MotivBase who will be sharing their insight about this and answering your questions as well. So feel free to send those questions to us in the Q&A box at the bottom of your toolbar. We've got close to 500 people that have registered for the webinar. We won't get to all the questions, but we'll try to get to as many as possible. Some probably new folks to the center. I want to spend just a few moments telling you a little bit about who we are and what we do since we're hosting the webinar. Our mission is to help the food system earn consumer trust. That's been our mission for over a dozen years. Our members include folks from across the entire food system. Our board of directors is very eclectic and includes companies like Costco and Kroger, as well as the National Pork Producers, or the National Pork Board, Dairy Farmers of America, World Wildlife Fund, and many, many others. We have three primary strategic priorities. One is to deliver some expanded food system trends and issues analysis, where we take insight and information from sources like MotivBase and others, and create insight that we share with the entire food system. Serving as a catalyst for more effective food system engagement, doing things like building coalitions and what we're doing today, where we bring people together to talk about some of the emerging trends and issues that are facing the food system, and then lead an informed narrative that builds trust. Certainly encourage you to learn more if you are interested by visiting our website at foodintegrity.org. Our format today for the webinar, you will hear from our panelists. I will ask them some specific questions about the alternative protein space, as well as the impact on animal-based protein. And then we're going to allow about half the time, about 30 minutes, for your questions. So your line is muted, but you can submit questions again in the Q&A box at the bottom of your toolbar at any time. We'll try to get to as many of those as possible. The webcast is being recorded. We will send a link to you following the webcast in an email, so you'll have a chance to share that with others if you would like. We'll also include a brief survey that it would be very helpful if you would complete. A question about other topics you would like to see us address, as well as kind of a one-page summary of some of the research and insight that MotivBase has done on protein alternatives, and you'll hear a little bit more about that as we go forward, so you'll be able to get that if you complete that as well. So again, thank you for joining us. Let me take the time now to introduce our panelists. David Irvin is Vice President of Alternative Proteins for Tyson Foods. He is responsible for overseeing the company's entrance into alternative protein. He joined Tyson in 2012 and has been instrumental in launching various branded products. Before joining Tyson, he began his career at Kraft Foods in research, marketing, and brand management, then worked at Dom Capital, where he identified investments in new consumer-based opportunities in food and beverage. David, thank you for joining us. Next up, two of our panelists from White Castle. First, Shannon Tolliver. She is the Social Responsibility and Environmental Sustainability Manager at White Castle System. As manager of the company's Environmental Sustainability Program, she educates and engages team members and customers about their sustainability programs and projects. She also works with suppliers on environmental sustainability issues. And Jamie Richardson is Vice President of White Castle, with a responsibility for communications, government affairs, shareholder relations, public relations, and corporate philanthropy. Prior to this role, Jamie served as Director of Marketing. He joined White Castle in 1998. You may recognize him from his more than 50 national television appearances. He's also frequently quoted in publications like the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, and Forbes. Shannon and Jamie, thank you for joining us very much. Next up, Ujjwal Arklegud is an award-winning cultural anthropologist and entrepreneur who began his career as an in-field researcher, conducting immersive ethnographies, directly observing and interacting with the entertainment and travel sectors. Over the next decade, while working at various technology and advertising firms, Ujjwal pioneered the study of consumer beliefs and culture on the internet. In 2015, he co-founded MotivIndex, a consumer research company that in just over a year became one of the fastest growing research startups in the world. In 2018, MotivIndex launched MotivBase, the world's first AI anthropologist that decodes trends to identify and quantify demand spaces. Ujjwal, thank you for joining us, and thanks to all of our panelists. David, we're going to start with you. Tyson obviously has a very rich history in animal-based protein and has taken its turn now in its beginning its work in alternative proteins. Help us understand what led to that. What was the driver, and what do you see as kind of the future of alternative proteins for Tyson?
Yeah. About 3 years ago, we started to author a new purpose and strategy for the company. Our purpose, which you might have heard, is raising the world's expectation for how much good food can do. And our strategy was set on sustainably feeding the world the fastest growing protein grains. It was an interesting dialogue. Each one of those words was actually carefully chosen as we built that. And one of the words that was debated was the word protein versus meat. So as we applied our strategy, we really looked at it from a consumer perspective to say, what are we bringing to consumers? What is that ultimate benefit? And protein really rose to the top. Once we defined protein within our strategy, a whole host of work streams began going from there. So once you change from the frame of reference from meat to protein, you obviously start looking at other protein sources. So alternative protein, we obviously are consumers, and many of us working and looking behind the glass saw what was going on, and we made an early investment in a company called alternative protein, and most recently have decided to enter this space.
David, if you could get a little closer to the microphone, that would be helpful.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Much better.
Can you hear me
No worries.
better?
Yep, much better. Thank you.
So we are absolutely in this market. We believe that we have core capabilities that can help grow and sustain and lead with our consumers in this space. And so as people have seen, we've recently launched a new brand called Raised and Rooted, and anticipate building this out as a platform versus a brand as we go forward.
Okay, great. Appreciate that. So Shannon, tell us a little bit about White Castle and why White Castle just started to move into the alternative protein space.
Yeah, so just a little bit of history on White Castle. We were founded in 1921 as a slider company. Our first 4 ingredients were a ground beef hamburger, apple pie, Coke, and coffee. And so that was in 1921. We moved east, and we have about 380 locations now. We're vertically integrated. We have 2 bakeries and 2 meat plants. And in the 80s, we realized that people were taking home our sliders to heat them up in this new thing called the microwave. So we started our retail division, and that has enabled us to expand beyond our the 13 states that we're in to all over the nation. So we're currently in the Midwest, mostly, I usually say, from St. Louis up to Minneapolis, over to New York, New Jersey, and down to Tennessee. We have expanded into Las Vegas. We have one in Phoenix, or soon to be one in Phoenix. And so that's really where we're at. We entered kind of the protein alternative based in 2015. We really, we've always been a company, since we're an almost 100-year-old company, we've had to adapt to changes. We survived the Great Depression. We went through the 40s and 50s with the food shortage and the labor issues. And so we've always had to adapt and change to what our customers want, to what our team members need. And so, and even I was researching a while ago, and in the 50s, because of the food shortages, we actually thought of, we didn't have it, but a peanut-based veggie slider. We never rolled it out then, but it was kind of cool to look at that and be like, hey, we were even thinking about that then. But so in around 2015, we really, noticed that a lot of people want alternative to our product, just for meat. And so we partnered with Dr. Parego's, and we launched our veggie slider with them. And so and that was a part-time, limited time, and then we actually rolled it out to full-time. So that's been on our menu since 2015, excuse me. And then we also have a black bean burger that we rolled out as well. And so our partnership with Impossible Foods began in 2018. And we had it as a limited time as well. And then we decided to roll it out about a year ago to all of our castles. And it's just, great to have an option to all of our other products. We're still a slider company. We still have our, beef slider, and we have chicken sliders. And so, it's just, we felt like it was important to have alternative choices for our customers, and our team members love it as well. So that's kind of our journey into that space.
Great, thanks. So Jamie, tell me a little bit about, from a marketing perspective, what role do alternatives play in White Castle's marketing as you think about going to market?
Yeah, I think for us, it's about how do you feed the souls of craver generations everywhere. And as Shannon mentioned, I think we went from thinking of ourselves as a burger company in the home of the original slider to really expanding that to think of ourselves as a slider business. And so what we found is that if years back, The Omnivore's Dilemma was a book we talked about and debated. Today, we might talk about The Omnivore's Delight because there are more choices for more people. And we found from a marketing point of view, or just engaging with our customers and our team members, that's been helpful and good. So, the hamburger is the heart and soul of who we are, but the Impossible Sliders added a nice bit of variety to the menu, and it has a loyal following. And candidly, sometimes it's not a vegan customer. Often it's someone who's getting a bacon double cheeseburger and one Impossible to go. So we're seeing that with our smaller size sandwiches is a nice way to mix and match.
So everybody's talked a little bit about reframing the menu from meat to protein. We'll come back and revisit that in just a minute. But Ujwal, I'd like to hear from you first in terms of the research that you've done. What's driving this? What's driving the fire of interest that we're seeing in alternative proteins today?
Sure. There's a lot of interesting factors behind it, and I'll start with one that sort of borrows from a point that Jamie just made about, it's not necessarily for somebody who's vegan. That's one of the major pieces we're seeing is that it's not just vegan culture that's driving this. It is a renewed interest amongst consumers to introduce plant-based or alternative protein sources into their daily or weekly diet. It's not about it being a regular source of protein. It's about having the choice and having the occasion to make that choice. There are a few interesting factors. One that really comes to mind is there's increased confusion in the marketplace about what the consumer considers to be the quality of the meat they buy. And obviously, there are innovations happening here, especially with IoT technology and so on. But fundamentally, fear on one side drives an interest in openness on the other side. So if I'm unsure as a consumer about the quality or the consistency of the quality of the meat that I'm getting, then suddenly I go and consider alternatives every now and then, especially when it comes to my children. There are a couple of other areas. Another area that often comes up is really interesting territory of enriched foods or functional foods. We are seeing consumers consider plant-based sources or alternative sources as being better suited to delivering a more enhanced nutritional value out of the things they eat. And this obviously in particular applies to packaged food and snacks in particular. But it's just really, really interesting because, as opposed to traditional sources of protein, the alternative sources are seen better suited to improving the sort of, if I can call it this, the per bite nutritional value.
Okay, interesting. So David, you mentioned that you've been looking at this landscape for some time. How would you describe the current state of the alternative protein market? Not just for Tyson, but just overall. How would you describe the current state of the alternative protein market?
I think we're clearly seeing a tipping point of consumer acceptance within this space. I think the biggest barrier that we've had in the past has been one of taste. As we've gotten better at creating tastier products from plants, we are seeing a renewed interest from consumers. And I think it does go back to what Jamie said previously. It's actually not the vegan vegetarians that are driving this market. It is meat eaters who are driving this market. And because it is meat eaters, you need to deliver on the expectations that people are getting from meat in order to win them over. And with the recent landscape, we're seeing that change and broad consumer acceptance starting to happen.
Okay. So Jamie, kind of going back to you on that point then, from a marketing standpoint, how do you differentiate the approaches as you think about marketing one kind versus another? And are you actually seeing the traction drive increased traffic or drive increased sales at White Castle by offering alternatives?
Yeah, I think to answer that question best, we just look at it through the lens of, is this connecting with our customers? And candidly, whenever we do anything new, the first indication we have of that is how do our 9,000 team members feel about it? And from the very beginning, when we rolled out to 140 restaurants 18 months ago, our team members were very enthusiastic. And so that was a great sign for us. We saw that also happen with customer response. So for us, it's not about one or the other. It's about offering more options. So our focus in terms of messaging is give it a try, because it is something brand new. And so I think our original signage showed an impossible slider, and the language around it was what the what, you know, in terms of how do you get to that? It looks like beef, sizzles like beef, and tastes like beef. And to the point just made, the taste is the differentiating factor. So I think what we've seen is a lot of repeat purchase. So as we continue forward, the thought is, hey, this is a foundation. When we launched it originally, we didn't have a barbecue sauce to go with it, but we're seeing it as a permanent menu item and something that can attract new customers. Definitely among our Gen Z and millennials, especially, we've seen an uptick in visits, and that's been really interesting and encouraging.
So Shannon, a quick question for you. I mean, obviously White Castle sells both meat and meat alternatives. How do you think about marketing one or engaging with one without in any way trying to demean or impugn the other? So how do you engage in that conversation with your customers and with your associates and others to say, we've got A and we've got B, but we're not going to pit A or B against each other?
Yeah, well, I think it goes back to what I said when I originally talked about how we were founded. We had four things to purchase in the 20s, and we've expanded that to chicken. We've got chicken sandwiches, we have chicken rings, we have French fries, and so it's really not about pitting one against the other. It's really about, we want to adapt to our consumers' preferences, and we know that there's a lot of restaurants out there. There's a lot of different choices, and so it's really about just making sure that we have a lot of choices. We're still a slider company, like I mentioned, but we can tailor that slider to different customers. And so we really looked at it as an addition, as well as all the other additional items that we've had. We've taken out items. We no longer sell apple pie, but you know, we're still sticking to our core. And so it's really, and it may change, you know, 20 years from now. As like I mentioned, as a 100-year-old company, we have to adapt and we have to change, and we have to look at what our customers are telling us. So, you know, we always say it's in addition to all the other items.
Okay. Just a reminder that if you have questions that you would like to pose to the panelists, there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your toolbar. We have a few questions coming in, but you can send those in. We'll ask a few more questions here, and then we'll turn it over and begin to ask your questions. So Ujwal, back to you. A couple of quick ones here. Fad or trend, and what can the meat protein sector learn from this?
Definitely not a fad. However, you know, I think a lot of the industry reports I read need to be dialed back a bit. It's not like meat eaters are only going to consume plant-based sources by any means. You know, we're definitely seeing an interest in this, but I think this is the one critical insight that I think the industry is slowly grabbing onto. But from a consumer perspective, we're seeing this loud and clear, which is that the consumer has actually a different set of expectations when it comes to plant-based or protein alternatives. The expectations are actually different than the expectations for traditional proteins or meat-based proteins, for example. Right now, a lot of the conversation, especially from a marketing perspective, is about how the alternative tastes or the experience is just like the original. But I think this will evolve slowly, because what the consumer has always wanted is a different set of expectations, and that applies to, you know, expectations around environmental sustainability, expectations around sort of, you know, labeling, messaging, and just openness in the sourcing of the food and the nutritional value it carries, as well as, you know, just different expectations in terms of how easy or difficult it is to digest, and overall impact on health and weight management and so on and so forth. So there are lots of different demand spaces emerging here, but the point I wanted to make, I think this is the most critical, is that the expectations are new and emerging, and they are different. And because these expectations are different, we're finding that it's become a culture in and of itself. It's relevant to about 40 million Americans, but it's not going to become relevant to 80 million Americans tomorrow. It's growing by about 4-5% year over year in terms of cultural relevance. So this is definitely a trend, but it's a trend that is slowly picking up steam. There's a lot of work yet to be done by companies and organizations that are trying to deliver what consumers really want and need. But it's definitely going to be a slow and steady progress.
Thank you. We'll come back to some more conversation around the consumer trends in just a minute. David, as you look at the expanding portfolio, I thought it was really fascinating that you kind of redefined Tyson's market space from meat to protein, and clearly in the alternate protein space now. Where do you see that going? I mean, what else is next as you think about kind of, and not just necessarily from Tyson, but obviously you deal with this globally as a global leader in the whole space. I mean, what do you see as emerging as we continue to see things move forward? And what are some of the obstacles that you have to overcome? I mean, we hear about concern about clean labeling and alternative proteins having too complex ingredients and so on and so forth. What do you see as what's next, and what are some of the barriers that have to be overcome?
Yeah, so I'll break it down into two components of what's next, and the reality of what's next is I don't know if we exactly know right now. I think we're all learning every day around what consumers are willing to accept and what consumers want. There's been a lot of discussion around cell-based meats, which is clearly an interesting area, and we'll see how that continues to unfold. We're also seeing lots of dialogue around algae and other protein sources. Insects continues to pop. That's the one that I'm always a bit cautious of, at least from a U.S. perspective. But we are clearly seeing lots of different spaces, and I think that the story is a bit out. I think as consumers learn more, I think their language, linguistics, and even their cultural norms are going to change as some of these things come out. I do think that the labeling will be kind of a big predictor for us of how these are accepted, and it might have different acceptance across different countries. But I think we've all been saying it, but the number one driver of plant-based areas is really around health and nutrition. That's what people are ultimately looking for in this space. And so different avenues in and different ways to help with health and nutrition, whether that comes from cleaner labels or whether that comes from different kind of sourcing, I think will be areas that will continue to dialogue specifically in the US. I will say health and wellness, while super important in the US, we are seeing different markets actually responding to different drivers. We talked about health and wellness. There's also taste and convenience in the U.S. And the third area of importance is sustainability. That kind of the importance of those changes as you go to different markets. So in the UK example, animal welfare is actually the driver even above health and wellness. And so in those markets, what you develop and how you market are actually going to be very different than what our choices that we're making in the US. The number one barrier continues to be taste. I think it's going to take a while for us to get over the taste profile, and one that we're going to continue to have to focus on. But again, I think it's the balance of taste and nutrition that we're going to have to balance as we go forward in the future and as this market develops fully.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So as I think everybody on the panel realizes, and is clearly being reflected in the questions coming through, there are people on both sides of this debate that have very strong feelings about the topic and whether or not alternative protein or meat protein are aligned with their philosophy, personal beliefs, and identities. Ujjwal, you mentioned that this isn't a vegan-driven movement, but you see meat eaters that are beginning to embrace this, but they're not going to give up meat anytime soon. And yet that's kind of the mission of the Impossible Burger, right? How do you see this playing out? Are most people that are trying alternative proteins staying away from either fringe, that it's either all meat or it's all vegan? How do you see that getting reconciled in the social conversation? Because you've got fairly fervent advocates on both sides.
Yeah, it's a great question. Every time, and we see this in every cultural movement, every time a new idea develops somewhere, it indicates or opens the door to opportunities for change in the established idea. So, what I mean by that is, and I'll take a tangible example here, if consumers are concerned about, let's say, the quality of their meat and, they worry about ingesting pesticides in the meat they buy, and they have concerns about the sourcing of the meat, they demand better labeling, they have concerns around, the feed that goes to these animals and so on and so forth. And that's pushing them to consider plant-based alternatives. Somewhere along that chain, somebody's going to come along that's going to solve that problem for them, to alleviate that concern, create better transparency, open certain doors that currently feel closed to the consumer. And again, I'm completely talking about this through the consumer's unadulterated perspective. So every time that happens, there's a yin and yang, and the moment the one door closes, another opens, and this is really what we see is that I think if we focus on why the shift is happening, we'll see opportunities on both sides of the aisle. So on the side of traditional protein, and if I look at meat in particular, you might see improvements in labeling, in tracking, and so on and so forth, in the use of IoT, and we've already seen some interesting models being tested by various retailers. On the other side, with plant-based sources, we're going to see the same requests come out again and again. So, for example, if you just track just the media's attention to the ingredients that go into plant-based burgers, for example, and I'm not going to get into any specific brands, but if you just look at just the media's attention to that in the last 6 months, it's slowly growing, and it's growing because consumers are slowly starting to ask the same questions they were asking about traditional sources of protein. Now they're asking the same questions about the new modern sources of protein and so on. So I don't think it's about one fringe or the other. I think what it's really about is the underlying reasons why, and that reason why gets applied no matter what the source of the protein is or what the product is that the consumer is buying. And it's just an indication of some major cultural shifts in terms of people's expectations around food in general.
Excellent, excellent. So for both Shannon and Jamie, let's start with you, and then we'll go back to you, David. In terms of attributes that you are using to market and promote your alternatives, tell us about how you're doing that. I mean, Ujwal's mentioned some cultural sensitivities around health and wellness, sustainability, et cetera. Well, I mean, what is kind of an intriguing, interesting way to grab people's attention, right? But as you think about other attributes and some of the conversation that the industry is having around this issue, how are you addressing those at White Castle?
I think for us, it's always been about providing a great value. So I think a big differentiator for us right in the very beginning was the price we're able to offer the sandwich for. So we sell the Impossible Slider for $1.99. And before we launched and had it available in all of our restaurants, typically you could only find it at a casual dining chain where you might pay $14 or $15 for an Impossible Burger. So I think for us, it comes back to value and taste. And we've really let consumers decide for themselves if it's something they're interested in. So it hasn't been, to your earlier question, a pitted battle of one sandwich versus the other. For us, it's more about offering people what they want when they want it. So, I mean, part of our service model is you can get any sandwich 24 hours a day, any menu item 24 hours a day whenever you come to our restaurant. So it's about, we believe we live in the greatest age in the history of humankind when it comes to food choices and all the things that are available to us. And so being able to be part of that makes us, as a small family-owned business, really happy and proud.
And I'll just add that I really like, we talked about that we have a Dr. Prego's veggie slider as well as Impossible and a black bean. And I feel like for us, it's really not marketing a plant-based versus a hamburger. It's if you don't really crave like a beef taste, then we have our veggie slider or Dr. Prego's, and that's totally vegetable-based. It doesn't taste like a hamburger at all. And so I really feel like we have the best of both worlds, where if you are a beef eater and you want to try the Impossible because it's similar, you have that option. But if you also just like veggies and you want the veggie slider, we have that option as well. And so for us, it's really about just trying to have a lot of choices available for our customers, but making sure they're good quality choices as well.
One of the questions that came through, just as a bit of an aside, any experimentation with blended product where you're actually looking at meat and meat alternatives combined in a product at White Castle, and experimentation there?
We have not, but we know we have probably over 500 people listening, so we might not even say if we had.
Fair enough. Fair enough. All right, David, I know that's a trend certainly in Europe and other parts of the world where people are looking to maintain similar mouthfeel, similar textures, some similar flavors, but also are looking for some of the attributes that come with products that aren't meat-based. Are you seeing that as a growing trend in terms of blends as another way to people to try to get the best of both worlds has been described?
Yeah, I mean, we are have not been shy. We are launching a product in the fresh meat case that is actually a blended product of Angus beef and pea protein. The benefits to it are clearly nutritional. What is interesting is by adding half plant to half meat, we're able to get all of the lusciousness that you get from meat, but also are able to get the functional benefits of plants. And so we're actually 60% less fat than a traditional 80-20 burger and 40% less calories than a traditional 80-20 burger. So for those people that are looking for a super lean but yet super delicious burger, we will have an offering for them that'll be launching in October.
Please don't.
That was a pretty good commercial, actually.
Please don't sue us if we start using the word lusciousness.
Yeah.
That's a good word.
All right, so we've had a couple of other questions come through, and some of them have been focused on kind of macronutrients, nutrition, et cetera. Thinking about that, David, I'm going to go back to you in terms of, you mentioned health and wellness in different markets around the world, et cetera. Where are you seeing, there was some conversation around a greater awareness now of the ingredients that are coming to bear in some of these. How is all of that coming to play into your decisions as you decide to look at alternatives and the nutritional value and micronutrients and some of those other attributes that come into play? How do you begin to think about that as the head of Tyson's alternative protein platform?
Yeah, I mean, across Tyson, we are pushing on different avenues of health. Health aspects could come from, exploring vegetables and grains. So we've launched a product, Adele's sausage blends, which has grains and vegetables along with our sausage. We also are the blended product that I talked about that'll be launched under Raised and Rooted. And then we also continue to explore and test with multiple brand offerings to determine health ways in. And we are finding there's actually two folds that we're looking at. One I talked about with the blends, which is absence of negatives, but we also launched a nugget made with plants that actually has presence of positives. So we actually added fiber and we added omega-3s through flaxseed into that item. And so we're looking at health, we're looking at multiple ways, whether it's absence of negative, positive, presence of positives. We're even looking at straight vegetables and grains and how we can add those in from a simplified ingredient.
Okay, great. Don't forget, you can ask your questions down at the Q&A box. They keep coming in. We're getting some consistent themes that we're trying to address as we connect with our various panelists. Ujwal, back to you. There have been several questions about how do we educate consumers on these issues, but let's flip that and move away from education. How do we successfully engage in this social dialogue or discourse to help people better understand the perspective around conventional meats, let's say, for example? That's where most of the questions are coming, is how do we better engage in that dialogue and that conversation?
Yeah, I mean, the first part about it is to understand the underlying why, the underlying motivational imprint that drives people to even become open to a new idea, a new thought. And when you think about the why, one of the things we're seeing is that a lot of the lead users, so the types of consumers that are driving this cultural shift, the lead users are driven by motivations that revolve around two things we're finding. The first is an increased or a renewed interest in wanting to do things that benefit other people. So wanting to make decisions, kind of vote with their wallet, if you will. There's a renewed interest in wanting to do that, and as a result, make choices that feel a little bit more sustainable. And I say a little bit because, as much as these are lead users, they're not willing to compromise on what they eat or how they enjoy their food or so on. So it's about taking small steps that make you feel like you're driving positive change. So the first is just understanding this motivation. And the interesting thing is, whenever we look at motivations from an anthropological perspective, we look at the other side of that coin, which is the fear. As human beings, we always have a positive and a negative that, enacts change and drives action. And the fear that dominates here is people don't want to pass by their lives feeling like they've done nothing for the betterment of society. And this kind of fear, this kind of motivation is something that is growing in terms of the number of people that engage with it, because it's a great alibi, Oh, why do you buy this? Because I'm voting with my wallet. I mean, what a great thing to talk about around the dinner table. It's the perfect alibi. It's the perfect way to get moral superiority, build symbolic capital, as they say. So this is really the underlying reason why, and driving engagement is about building empathy for this why. For showing the consumer that we understand and empathize with exactly this motivation or this fear, and we deliver or can deliver solutions that help them address this fear and help them address this motivation, if you will.
Okay, great. So Shannon and Jamie, kind of back to you, based on your market research and consumer insights and the feedback that you're getting directly at White Castle, what's the driver for your customer? What are you hearing from the people that stop and buy either of your non-meat alternative burgers at White Castle?
I think it hits a theme that we heard earlier, the taste. People are surprised if it's the first time they've sampled and had that opportunity. And then they come back because they really do enjoy the taste. And candidly, it's not widely available yet other places. So that gives us an advantage in that regard. And it becomes a regular repeat purchase for many individuals. So maybe our sandwiches are small. So as a result, someone might buy one as part of 4 sandwich order. The next time they might buy 2 or 3. So I think that part of it. I think my second favorite word I've heard today, maybe it's my new favorite, was transparency that was mentioned earlier. And I think that element of it too, in terms of how everyone feels about their food these days. And I think the more we're able to share that, I know Shannon's done a lot on our policies around animal welfare and a lot of other things. And our customers don't just like that. They really are increasingly demanding it. So I think the fact that they know about Impossible, they're learning a little bit more, but then they taste it and like it. That's the big breakthrough, is that the taste is something that they can crave and feel great about.
And I would just say the other thing is why people come back, and I think because we do have that alternative, and we kind of talk about it as the veto vote. So if you're a family of 4 or 6 and you've got one really vegetarian that may, and so now we have this option where you can still come to White Castle. Everybody can get what they want, or they can get multiple orders, but we also have that choice. And so I think that helps people come back knowing that, if the whole family wants to go there and I don't want to be the one that sticks out, then at least I can get, a veggie slider or Impossible slider. So
I had a 13-year-old daughter who was always the veto vote for a while, but fortunately she's past that at this point, so it works out well. So David, as you think about Tyson's portfolio, what do you see as some of the challenges to scale? I mean, obviously you're exploring the entire universe. Again, it's fascinating to think about the transition from meat to protein and the variety of things in which you are exploring today. What are some of the challenges you see of scaling?
I mean, I think one of the benefits of Tyson is actually scale. So we obviously have quite a bit of supply relationships that we have access to, and we also have kind of the processing power to bring this important initiative to the masses and really look at how do we do this in a way that we can be cost efficient and still deliver what consumers are looking for. So overall, I think scale is a big benefit. The one interesting thing that I would say is, while I think peas and vegetables are actually available widely, it's the processing that's required in order to get the taste and texture that we need that is takes a bit of energy, both from pulling the isolates out of the peas, as well as processing it with heat, moisture, and pressure in order to develop those textures that people are looking for. So it's, I think the supply is there. The processing will get there quickly, and we're just going to have to marry those two as we go.
So you mentioned another thing that I want to follow up on that I thought was pretty interesting, and you know, we've all seen the proliferation of absence label claims. I was in a baby food aisle in a grocery store in Brazil not long ago and picked up a squeezable tube, and it said 0% everything, right? And so it was free of everything. But you also mentioned that kind of the move to the promotion of positives. Where do you see that evolution happening? How do you see that playing out? Are we at absence label fatigue yet, or are we still seeing the absence of negatives be something that drives interest? Because I haven't heard people talk much about the presence of positives. That was something that was new and different.
Yeah, I mean, I think the absence is always an easy one, and it's one that's very motivating to consumers. I do think it takes a bit more effort and interest to find those motivating factors that are the positives. What's nice about plant-based proteins is it comes with a halo of so much positivity coming from plants that I think continuing to focus on what are those most motivating messages and using plant positivity to get there is a great marketing challenge for all of us.
So Ujjwal, kind of transitioning back to you on that same question, the proliferation of absence label claims playing on fear versus the addition and the promotion of positive. What's happening in that space, and what do you see happening in that space with the greater consumer interest around food and the impact of food on health and wellness, society, animals, the environment, et cetera?
It's a great question. I mean, at the moment, it's still about the absence label or the absence claim. That's really what's driving it. You know, we see this time and time again in every culture. Every time there's a shift, the pendulum always swings to the extreme end before it settles back down. And that's we're, you know, in the throes of one such swing at the moment. It will change, and we are slowly starting to see small but emerging demand spaces that are asking about the positives from meat alternatives. You know, for example, there are discussions going on about the nutritional value and potential nutritional deficiencies from plant-based diets or from plant-based substitutes and so on and so forth. So there is a lot of that starting to brew. You know, we like to use the term microculture to say that, you know, if you look at the protein alternative marketplace, there are a bunch of different microcultures right now. The microculture of absence claims is the dominant one, but there are others that are brewing, and at some point it will, it will change. But at the moment, still, because the motivation is so much of, you know, wanting to see change in a traditional industry from the consumer's perspective, again, from the lead consumer's perspective, it is still very much driven by the absence claim.
Got it. So, David, quickly to you, and then kind of a similar question, Shannon, to you and Jamie in just a minute. Do you see any pushback related to the processing that takes place to require this? I mean, as people are looking for simpler food or whole food or however you describe it, some people are moving toward plant-based alternatives, and is there a conflict or is there a perceived conflict with some about the processing that has to take place to give them that same flavor and texture that they enjoy in other products?
Yeah, I think we're clearly seeing some conversations begin to come up around processing, and I think it's one that we'll continue to watch and understand. The other side of it is with taste being so important, in order to get to that taste, there's certain things that need to happen in order for us to develop that. So I think the number one driver is really going to be taste. I think if we don't have that and we come up with a carrot slider, I don't know if people are going to flock to it as much as they're flocking to some of these other areas that kind of deliver on their taste. So I think it's going to be an interesting one that we're going to be debating and working through for years to come, because ultimately the end consumer and taste usually is the winner.
Great, thank you. Shannon, Jamie, back over to you. So from your perspective, are you getting any feedback at all, or is it primarily taste and then third taste that is driving people to come and get whatever they choose to buy at White Castle?
Yeah, I think now and then we'll get a comment or a question on our customer comment line that's more interested and wants to go deeper in terms of understanding, nutritional values. But really, truly, it is. I mean, the triple threat of taste, taste, and taste, as you just said. I think it's part of a larger dialogue. But I think there's so much. We've encountered so much glee with people who are just happy we have the sandwich available. There's been less questioning about overall nutritional value. We've never positioned it or marketed it as a nutraceutical, although that carrot slider would be perfect for 2020.
I was wondering if that was going to be a foreshadowing of something we might see on a menu soon. So a lot of the questions that we're getting are really diving into some fairly complex kinds of technical issues. What about the micronutrients? Is there a conversation about the need to eat more plant-based and the impact of animal agriculture on the planet, and some more complex issues like that drive industry conversation? Do you hear that? What role do those conversations play in procurement and marketing and sales at White Castle?
I'll let Jamie talk about, internally, from a sustainability perspective, we talk about the just global issues, not just with White Castle, but other chains. What are the give and takes of, animal proteins versus plant-based, and environmental aspects, positive and negative of either one. So I think it's definitely a more global issue and not something that we can tackle with just one brand by itself. And so it definitely takes it industry-wide. And so that's just from a global sustainability perspective.
So do you see any tension in that based on either the animal proteins or the plant-based protein, because there are different perspectives being raised in the Q&A box about both of those as it relates to sustainability as one potential issue?
Yeah, I think for us, it's really been around being keenly aware of where our customers are, because we understand if we're not in lockstep and aware of every generation of our customers, including millennials and Gen Z, and what their values are and what's important to them, we ignore that at our own peril. So I think for us, it's really driven by the market in terms of what's available, and really hopefully being a quarter step ahead of providing things as customers want it and being part of the dialogue and the conversation, not running away from it. But we recognize we live a little bit, if we had our address these days, it might be Paradox Alley. We're the nation's first fast food hamburger chain. We were the first chain to come out with the Impossible Slider chain-wide. So, you look at that and say, well, that seems contradictory. But at the heart of it, for us, it's not. It's a double helix of how do we connect with customers in a way that matters. And I think that's our governing and guiding principle. So we're engaged in the conversation, want to be. We don't know if we have the solution. We want to be able to be a contributor.
Got it. So Ujwal, several other questions about, all right, so what does the meat industry, what do farmers and ranchers do about this? And there's been a lot of angst and a fair amount of attacking protein alternatives, but how do those engaged in animal protein production, who understandably are concerned about this, how do they answer the why question? How do they get engaged?
It's a great question, and it relates to a point that's brought up a lot, right, which is taste. And I actually want to start there because I think a lot of us forget that it's like buying a car. Obviously, it needs to work, it needs to drive, and the same goes for food. It needs to have taste, otherwise we're not going to eat it. So I actually think we need to set taste aside, because that's the requirement of any food. I think the bigger challenge is what's going to happen once the excitement dies down, right? Once the shiny new object is no longer shiny, what are the questions that people are going to start to raise and that are going to gain steam? And this is going to happen whether we like it or not. It's happening. We're already seeing it happen. And as for those of you who will receive the one-pager, you'll see some of those issues outlined. People are going to ask about, specific preservatives. People are going to ask about the level of processing that's gone into food. People are going to ask about whether something aids or worsens the food waste problem, and so on and so forth. And of course, nutrition is going to be a huge component of that as well. So the first part of my answer is to those who aren't in the alt protein industry is to say, be patient, because the same questions that you get faced with, the other side will also get faced with sooner rather than later. And when I say sooner, I mean in the next 12 months or so, this will come up. It's already starting, and we can see it's growing quite significantly. The second side of that is that a lot of these questions that consumers are raising, they all open doors or offer opportunities for, pardon the expression, the traditional protein industry or the existing mainstream protein industry to think about innovations. So, for example, if the question is about nutrition, how do we elevate the nutritional value of a pork tenderloin, for example? This is one use case I bring up because consumers don't understand the nutritional value necessarily of the different types of meat they eat or they don't eat, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of doors that are opening through this, and no matter what your business is, I think the point that I want to leave everybody with is that there are innovation opportunities on both sides of the aisle, and we have to make them. For the plant-based or the alt industry, right now the alt industry is riding a bit of a high, and it will slow down. We're seeing the slowdown, and that's when people need to be ready in order to deal with the same challenges that the traditional industry is dealing with right now.
So from your perspective, the interest in alt protein creates the opportunity for a better dialogue across the entire protein sector.
Absolutely. So I saw a recent example of a retailer that is testing, and I can't go into who, but they're testing a solution where they will tell the consumer exactly which farm that particular cut of meat comes from, and they will provide the consumer information on what was fed to the animal at that farm. So that's just one amongst other innovations that are starting to come up. So if the consumer says, hey, I feel like everything is, happening behind closed doors when it comes to my meat, and suddenly there's somebody offering a solution, that is now opening a door and, improving and removing certain barriers that were pushing people to consider plant-based source in the first place. Now, if I add to that or layer on the ongoing stress that consumers feel around processed food, suddenly a cut of meat becomes quite exciting and quite comforting for a dad or mom who's buying something for their kids or what have you, right? So I think it's really about looking at the various issues in the various demand spaces, understanding which of them we can have an impact on and innovate on, and to build upon them, because I don't think any one industry is free from the pressures that consumers are exerting, and it applies to everybody.
Excellent. So, David, back to you, and not to ask you a question that's against your interest, but you have colleagues at Tyson that are not working on alternative proteins, but working on other proteins. As you think about the broader Tyson protein platform, are there some of the same drivers that are driving your work, influencing the work of others that might be working in pork or poultry or beef or other sectors of the meat industry?
I mean, overall, we're all in food, right? And that's ultimately going to drive a lot of the conversations that we're having and that we're doing. And ultimately, we're about feeding the world and doing it in a positive way. So we all come with the same intent to work every day. We're maybe working on different things, but ultimately, we're all trying to achieve the same area. The other interesting thing that I would say is what we're seeing is currently the alternative protein area is actually an and to the meat industry. We're seeing a lot of incrementality in this space overall. And so I think we see it as an opportunity in total for all of us to feed the world.
Great. All right, one more question for the folks at White Castle, and then we'll drop to the Q&A box again. If you've got something else that you'd like to offer or a question you'd like to have asked, please send it in now, because we're getting very close to the end. We'll wrap up today asking each panelist what is the single one message or item, one thing they'd like to leave the audience with today. So Shannon and Jamie, what's next? As you think about innovation and evolution and continuing to look at all the different consumers that are out there today, with the favorite diet being my diet, whoever I happen to be. What do you see next? What's happening next at White Castle?
I think for us, it comes down to, as a family-owned business, being authentic. I love the talk we've had in this hour about transparency, because there is a greater hunger for more knowledge, more awareness about not just sourcing, but what else regarding the quality of food. And really, it's interesting. It comes full circle because almost 100 years ago, when we started as a hamburger chain, that was the big barrier. People didn't trust ground beef. And so we had to overcome that fear and let moms everywhere know it was okay to feed this to their family. So I think for us, it's a continued focus on being challenging ourselves to come up with great tastes that are distinctive, because we're a small family-owned chain that's just regional. So that's where our point of difference is. And there's more food science and awareness today than ever. We're really thankful for all of our partners, beef providers, the chicken providers, the pork providers, and Impossible Foods. It's all part of the team for us.
And I think for us, regarding like sustainability, it's about choice. I mean, we all have choices. There's things in moderation. We need to, tailor our diets to moderation. And so we just continue to be available to offer choices to our customers. So.
Excellent. All right, so we're going to ask the same question of each of you. We'll go in the same order. David, we'll start back with you, and then we'll go to Shannon and Jamie, and then Ujwal wrap up with you. So as we begin to wrap up, what is the one thing you'd like to leave the audience with, or the final parting thought you'd like to share? David?
I think I said it previously, but if I think about alternative protein, in the end, it's about serving consumers food. And I think providing choice and options can only help us as a total food industry to make sure we're servicing the end.
Great, thank you. Shannon, Jamie?
I just, I would reiterate what David said, and what I said earlier is just, for just having choices is great. We, especially with all the competition in restaurants today, we need to do that, and we will continue to look at choices and what our consumers really want.
Yeah, and I would echo that and say, for us, it's about innovation, but that innovation has to be focused on asking our customers what they want, listening intently to what they tell us, and then acting accordingly.
Great. We did have somebody respond, by the way, that eating too many carrots, having too much beta-carotene can be bad for you as well. So just a note of caution if you're thinking about the carrot slider.
There goes the 2020 vision strategy.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. All right, Ujwal, what's the parting words of wisdom you would have for the group today?
I think just simply that we have to focus on the why, not the what. I think ultimately, we live in a world where there's a new shiny object every 2 days. If we can focus on why people take an interest in something, then we can solve those problems in many different ways. We can solve it through plant-based solutions. We can solve it through innovative agriculture techniques. We can solve it through, innovating on existing product lines and so on and so forth. So I think, for us, that's the most interesting part about human beings, is understanding why we do what we do, and how that why is really changing and evolving for large groups of consumers, because that really tells us about where culture is headed and what the future of food is really going to be.
Excellent. Well, David Irvin and Tyson, thank you. Shannon Tolliver and Jamie Richardson from White Castle, thank you very much. Ujwal Arklegood from MotivBase, thanks to you. Really appreciate it and your time today. I hope everyone who participated and listened in found the information valuable. You will receive a follow-up email with a quick survey. We'd appreciate your input as we plan for other CFI live events. You'll also get kind of the one-page summary of MotivBase's insight on protein alternatives if you are kind enough to click the link and go to complete that survey. And we do take your feedback seriously, so we really would like to know what topics would be of interest to you going forward. For those interested in communicating about gene editing in food and agriculture, particularly startup companies, we'll be hosting a free webinar on September 25th called Trust in Gene Editing. Your company's future depends on it. And my colleague Amy DePlata-Church and I will detail the latest research on communicating about gene editing, how consumers adopt the technology, new approaches to engaging, and proven research-based keys to earning trust. Guess what? It's not about science. So you can register at foodintegrity.org if you would like to participate in that. You'll also find more information about CFI, our mission, and our trainings and our programs. We encourage you to go there to learn more, and your feedback is always most welcome. So thanks again to our panelists. Very much appreciated. Thanks for joining us today, and you'll have access to the recording shortly. Appreciate it, and have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.